There is a silence, so heavy it tastes like copper, and the metallic scent of a storm about to break. It's the hollow, ringing sound of a life stripped down to its last dollar. The realization that you are one unpaid debt away from being erased in a city that never knew your name. For Danielle Johnson, that silence led her to a penthouse hovering over the neon veins of Seoul, where a man with ink on his skin and ice in his veins was about to block the exit and offer her a choice: become his shadow or become a memory. Click. The sound was sharp, mechanical, and absolute. It was the whisper of magnetic locks sealing the heavy glass door, cutting off the hum of the world outside. Danielle's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't move. She didn't have to look back to know the exit was gone. A moment ago, this had been a high-stakes interview for a domestic executive, a sanctuary of polished marble, silk upholstery, and a panoramic view of the Namsan Tower. Now it was a gilded interrogation room, and she was trapped inside with Kang Ji-hwan, a predator who looked like a king and moved like a killer. Ji-hwan didn't sit. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who owned the air Danielle was currently struggling to breathe. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, the light of the setting sun catching the intricate tattoos that climbed from beneath his collar to the edge of his jaw, dark ink that looked like shadows come to life. "You think you're here for a cleaning job, Danielle," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in the small of her back. "You think you're here because of your glowing references from the villas in Itaewon." Danielle found her voice, though it felt thin and fragile. "I need the work. My brother, he's in trouble back home. I just need to send the money." Ji-hwan turned, and for the first time he let her see his eyes. They weren't just cold, they were ancient, filled with the weight of things better left buried. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the obsidian desk. It slid across the surface, stopping inches from her trembling hands. "Your brother isn't just in debt, Danielle. He's a ghost, and he didn't die in a random robbery in Detroit. He died because he was brave. And in my world, bravery is just another word for a death sentence." Danielle's breath hitched. "What are you talking about? He was a driver. He just delivered packages." "He delivered truth," Ji-hwan countered, leaning over the desk until she could smell the expensive tobacco and sandalwood clinging to his suit. "He delivered truth," Ji-hwan countered, leaning over the desk until she could smell the expensive tobacco and sandalwood clinging to his suit. "He was a whistleblower. He spent 6 months documenting the movements of the Seven Stars Syndicate, a rival group that makes their billions by moving human cargo across these borders. Women, Danielle. Women who look like you, who come here seeking a better life and find themselves in a cellar." He tapped the folder. Inside were grainy photographs of her brother, Marcus, meeting with men in dark alleys, and ledgers of names, victims Marcus had tried to save. "The debt collectors at your door back in the States aren't banks. They're the Seven Stars Reach, making sure the sister of the man who almost ruined them pays the price in blood." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a maid in a foreign land anymore. She was the final loose end of a war she hadn't known she was fighting. Ji-hwan reached out, his gloved hand tilting her chin up so she was forced to meet his predatory gaze. "I'm not a good man, Danielle, but I am a man of balance. Your brother's information was meant for me. He died trying to get it to my desk. Now you're going to finish what he started. You're going to be my eyes inside their house. Or you can walk out that door and see how long you last before the shadows find you." The weight of the choice was a crushing tide. She looked at the locked door, then back at the man who held her life in his scarred hands. "What do I have to do?" she whispered. A ghost of a smile touched Ji-hwan's lips, sharp, dangerous, and entirely possessive. "You're going to clean their house, Danielle, and while you're at it, you're going to help me burn it down." The transition was swift, surgical, and left no room for second guessing. Within an hour, Danielle's meager belongings in her cramped gosiwon were packed into a single black duffel bag by two silent men in dark suits. She was whisked away in a car with windows so tinted the neon lights of Seoul became nothing more than ghostly smears of violet and blue. When the elevator doors opened again, she wasn't in a lobby or an office. She was standing in the heart of Ji-hwan's private world. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of glass and cold white stone, perched so high the clouds felt like neighbors. "This is your base of operations," Ji-hwan said, his voice echoing slightly in the minimalist foyer. He didn't look back at her as he led her toward a master suite that felt larger than her entire apartment. "From this moment on, Danielle Johnson the maid is dead. You are now an extension of my will." In the dressing room, the transformation began. There were no cheap cotton uniforms or scuffed flats here. Instead, a row of garments hung with military precision, organized by texture and tone. Ji-hwan ran a hand over a silk blouse the color of moonlight. To catch a monster, you must blend into his lair. The 7 stars pride themselves on excess. If you look like a servant from a bargain agency, they will ignore you. But if you look like a luxury they can't afford, they will trust you. He gestured to the wardrobe, a collection of expensive camouflage. There were tailored black trousers that moved like liquid, cashmere sweaters, and high-collared silk dresses that looked modest but felt like a second skin. Even the aprons were crafted from fine linen, designed to make her appear as a high society fixture rather than a laborer. "Try them on," he commanded, his gaze lingering on her with a clinical intensity that made her skin prickle. "Every stitch is reinforced. The buttons on your blazer are cameras. The heel of your shoe contains a tracker." Danielle reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cool, expensive silk. It was a far cry from the polyester blend she had worn to the interview. As she changed, the reflection in the obsidian-framed mirror startled her. The woman staring back looked polished, lethal, and devastatingly out of her league. She looked like someone who belonged in a palace, even if she was only there to burn it down. Ji-hwan appeared in the reflection behind her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. The weight of his touch was grounding and terrifying all at once. "You look perfect, Danielle, like a secret wrapped in silk." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Remember, the more beautiful the wrapping, the more dangerous the gift. Tomorrow, the mission begins." Ji-hwan motioned for her to sit at a low, glass-topped table in the center of the room. On its surface lay a small, velvet-lined case containing what looked like delicate jewelry, but the way the light caught the micro-circuitry suggested something far more intrusive. "The 7 stars sweep for standard electronics," Ji-hwan explained, his voice dropping to a low murmur as he moved behind her. "Traditional earpieces are a death sentence. We use bone conduction." He leaned in, his proximity sending a jolt of static electricity through the air between them. Danielle felt the heat radiating from his chest as he reached around her, his fingers steady and cool against the sensitive skin of her neck. He wasn't just fitting equipment, he was marking territory. His touch was clinical, yet the lingering pressure of his thumb against her jawline felt intentionally slow. "This is a subdermal transmitter," he whispered, pressing a small, flesh-colored adhesive behind her ear. "It vibrates against the bone. You'll hear my voice inside your head. No one else will hear a sound." As he worked, his chest brushed against her shoulder, and Danielle found herself holding her breath. The scent of him, expensive leather, and something sharp, like ozone before a lightning strike, filled her senses. When he moved to her wrist to clasp a watch that served as a panic button, his tattooed fingers lingered on her pulse point. He felt the frantic, rabbit-like thrum of her heart. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, The mission, the rivalry, and the danger faded, leaving only the raw, magnetic pull of a man who looked at her not as a pawn, but as a prize. "Your heart is racing, Danielle," he noted, his thumb tracing the blue vein in her wrist. "Is it fear or is it me?" "Does it matter?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Either way, I'm trapped." Ji-hwan leaned closer, his face inches from hers, his intense gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "There is a difference between being a prisoner and being protected. I told you that you were an extension of my will. That means no one touches you, no one looks at you, no one speaks to you without my permission." The possessiveness in his tone was a physical weight, both terrifying and strangely grounding. He wasn't just giving her tools, he was weaving himself into her very biology. "If you get into trouble," he said, his voice dropping to a predatory growl, "you don't pray to God, you whisper my name. I will be listening to every breath you take." He stood abruptly, the spell breaking, but the tension remaining thick enough to choke. He handed her a small earpiece for her to practice with. "Get some rest. Tomorrow you enter the lion's den. And remember, Danielle, you belong to the shadow now." The transition from the sterile luxury of Ji-hwan's penthouse to the suffocating opulence of the Seven Stars estate felt like moving from a cold mountain peak into a humid swamp. The mansion was a sprawling monstrosity of gold leaf, heavy velvet, and the stench of old money bought with young lives. Danielle stood in the service entrance, her spine straight, her hands clasped over her linen apron. She was no longer Danielle Johnson. She was a ghost in the machinery of a criminal empire. "Move it, girl," a head housekeeper barked, her voice like grinding gravel. "The master doesn't like to wait for his tea." As Danielle walked through the corridors, she felt the slight vibration behind her ear, a low-frequency hum that settled her nerves. It was the phantom presence of Ji-hwan. Even though he was miles away, his silence was a promise of protection. She reached the grand dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a table of polished mahogany that could seat 40. The air here was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the lingering fear of the staff. She began her routine, her movements fluid and practiced, just as they had rehearsed in the penthouse. She polished the silver with a rhythmic grace, her eyes scanning the room for the specific heat signatures and blind spots Ji-hwan had mapped out for her. The rival boss, a man named Choi with a reputation for skinning his enemies alive, would be sitting at the head of this table in less than an hour. Under the guise of smoothing the heavy silk tablecloth, Danielle dropped to one knee to adjust a fallen napkin. In one swift, blurred motion, she reached beneath the mahogany lip of the table. Her fingers found the sweet spot, the junction where the wood met the steel frame. She pressed the micro-transmitter into place. The adhesive bonded instantly, the diamond-shaped device humming to life as it synced with the transmitter behind her ear. "I'm in," she whispered, the sound barely a breath. The vibration behind her ear pulsed twice, Ji-hwan's signal of acknowledgement. It was a dark, intimate heartbeat. "You there! What are you doing under the table?" Danielle froze. A guard stood in the doorway, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. His eyes were narrow, suspicious, tracing the lines of her silhouette. She didn't panic. She channeled the cold, untouchable energy Ji-hwan had instilled in her. She stood slowly, holding up a stray piece of lint she'd pulled from the carpet. "The master demands perfection," she said, her voice a calm, melodic ice. "I was ensuring he gets it." The guard stared at her for a long beat, his gaze lingering too long on the curve of her neck, before he grunted and turned away. Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had planted the seed of their destruction in the heart of their sanctuary. Now she just had to survive long enough to watch it grow. The extraction from the Seven Stars mansion had been silent and shadowed, but the adrenaline still hummed in Danielle's veins long after she returned to the penthouse. The city below was a carpet of shimmering lights, yet the air inside the glass walls felt thick with unspoken things. She found Ji-hwan on the balcony, his blazer discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the cuffs as he stared out at the Namsan Tower. He didn't turn when she approached. The moonlight caught the ink on his skin, making the dragons and geometric patterns crawl across his shoulders. "You did well today," he said, his voice barely louder than the wind. "Choi's men are arrogant. They see a uniform, not a person. They never saw you at all." "I felt you the whole time," Danielle admitted, stepping closer until she was standing just behind him. "The vibration, it felt like you were breathing right next to me." Ji-hwan turned then, his expression unreadable. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of the silk collar he had chosen for her. Then, slowly, he began to unbutton his own shirt, pulling the fabric back to reveal his chest. Danielle gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Amidst the beautiful, terrifying tattoos were jagged, raised lines of white scar tissue that the ink couldn't quite hide. They weren't from a surgeon's scalpel or a clean fight. They were marks of torture, of a man who had been broken and put back together with a harder soul. One long scar ran directly over his heart, a jagged lightning bolt that seemed to throb with his pulse. "Every dragon you see covers a wound," Ji-hwan whispered, taking her hand and placing it directly over the scar on his chest. His skin was hot, his heart a heavy, steady thud against her palm. "I wasn't born a boss, Danielle. I was born a victim of the same men who took your brother. They held me for 3 months when I was 20. They wanted to see how much a nobody could endure." Danielle felt a tear prick her eye. The monster didn't feel like a monster anymore. He felt like a mirror. "Is that why you're doing this? Not just for power, but for them?" "I don't believe in justice," he said, his hand closing over hers, pinning it to his chest as his eyes darkened with an intense, possessive heat. "I believe in debt, and Choi owes me a lifetime of blood. But tonight," he leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, "tonight, for the first time in 10 years, I don't want to think about the debt. I only want to feel this." The kiss was desperate and tasted of salt and iron, a collision of two broken people finding a strange, dangerous sanctuary in the dark. In the shadow of the Namsan Tower, the contract between them shifted. It was no longer just about a mission. It was about survival, and a love that felt like a war. The next week at the Seven Stars estate was a blur of high-stakes surveillance and bone-deep exhaustion. Danielle moved like a ghost, her ears always tuned to the low-frequency hum of Ji-hwan's presence. She had become an expert at the silent dance of the invisible, gathering names and dates that would eventually hang every man in the building. But exhaustion breeds shadows, and in the world of the Mafia, a single shadow can be a death sentence. It happened in Choi's private study, a room that smelled of expensive scotch and rot. Danielle was buffing the brass handles of a heavy mahogany cabinet, her movements rhythmic and hypnotic. In the corner of her eye, she saw a burner phone sitting atop a stack of shipping manifests. It was the Holy Grail, the direct link to the offshore accounts Ji-hwan needed to dismantle the syndicate's financial heart. With one eye on the heavy oak door, she reached out. Her fingers shook as she pulled a miniature scanner from her hem. "I have the phone, Ji-hwan," she breathed into the bone conduction mic. "Initiating scan now." "Careful, Danielle." His voice rumbled in her head, dark and protective. "You have 90 seconds before the guard rotation." The scanner hummed, a tiny blue light crawling across the screen of the burner phone. 10%, 50, the seconds ticked by like hammer blows against her skull. At 90%, the heavy latch of the study door clicked. Danielle fumbled. The scanner slipped from her damp palm, clattering against the brass handle with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot. She lunged for it, but the door was already swinging open. It wasn't a common guard. It was Choi's second in command, a man with a jagged scar across his throat and eyes that had long ago forgotten how to blink. He didn't ask questions. He didn't shout. He saw the black device in her hand and the look of sheer, frozen terror on her face. In 2 strides, he was across the room. His hand, thick and calloused, slammed into her jaw, sending her sprawling across the marble floor. The scanner shattered. "Ji-hwan!" she shrieked, the name tearing from her throat before she could stop it. The man sneered, grabbing her by the hair and jerking her head back. So, the little mouse has a name for her master. He pulled a jagged knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the dim light. Miles away, in the silence of the penthouse, Ji-hwan stood frozen. Through the transmitter, the sound of the blow had been a sickening thud, followed by the raw, jagged tear of Danielle's scream. Then, the transmission began to crackle with the sound of a struggle, the heavy breathing of a predator, and the whimpering of his prize. "Danielle!" Ji-hwan roared into his mic, his voice a terrifying explosion of rage. But there was no answer, only the sound of the transmitter being ripped from her skin, followed by a haunting, static-filled silence. The lion's den had finally snapped shut, and his light had just been extinguished. The silence in the penthouse had transformed from a sanctuary into a scream. Ji-hwan didn't call his captains. He didn't wait for backup. A man who had spent his life building a fortress of logic and cold calculation was now driven by a singular, primal impulse. He drove through the rain-slicked streets of Incheon, the engine of his black sedan roaring like a beast unleashed. The shipyard was a skeletal graveyard of rusted shipping containers and towering cranes that groaned in the wind. At the center of the wasteland sat a sprawling, dilapidated warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stagnant seawater and diesel. Danielle was bound to a rusted chair in the center of a salt-stained concrete floor, a single industrial light swaying above her. Her lip was split, and her silk blouse, the camouflage Ji-hwan had chosen with such pride, was torn and stained with oil. She looked up as the heavy steel doors of the warehouse groaned open. A silhouette stood framed against the moonlight, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a dark suit that seemed to swallow the light. Ji-hwan didn't hide. He walked into the center of the kill zone, his hands visible, his expression so calm it was more terrifying than any mask of rage. "You're late, Kang," Choi's second-in-command sneered, stepping out from behind a stack of crates. He held a pistol to Danielle's temple. Around the perimeter, 5 more men emerged from the shadows, their weapons leveled at Ji-hwan's chest. Danielle's eyes widened, frantic and pleading. She tried to speak through the gag, her muffled cries a desperate warning. She realized then, with a soul-crushing clarity, why they hadn't killed her immediately. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was the lure. They knew Ji-hwan wouldn't send a strike team. They knew he would come for her himself, exposing the king to save the pawn. "Let her go," Ji-hwan said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the metal walls. He didn't look at the guns pointed at his heart. His gaze was locked on Danielle, anchored to her with a ferocious intensity. "She has nothing to do with the debt." "She is the debt," the gunman countered, thumbing the hammer of his weapon, "and you're the payment." Ji-hwan took another step forward, ignoring the red laser dots dancing across his white shirt. He reached into his coat, and for a heartbeat, every finger tightened on a trigger. But he didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a small black detonator. "You think I came here to negotiate?" Ji-hwan's voice dropped to a predatory whisper. The dragons on his neck seemed to writhe in the flickering light. "I didn't come to bring you back into the fold, Choi. I came to bury the fold with you inside it." Danielle saw the look in Ji-won's eyes, the same look he'd had when he told her he was a man of balance. He was willing to burn the entire world down, himself included, just to ensure she wasn't the only thing lost in the fire. The warehouse erupted in a deafening roar as Ji-won triggered the perimeter charges he had planted before entering. The floor shuddered, and the stacks of rusted shipping containers groaned, leaning precariously over the gunman. The distraction was only a second, but in Ji-won's world, a second was an eternity. He moved like a shadow given lethal form. He didn't draw a gun. He drew a short, blackened blade from a sheath hidden along his forearm. Before the man holding Danielle could pull the trigger, Ji-won was on him. The blade flashed in the strobe light flicker of the dying overhead bulb, and the gunman collapsed, his hand falling away from Danielle's hair. Chaos surged through the dark. Gunfire sparked like angry fireflies, the bullets pinging off metal and concrete. Ji-won used a falling crate as a shield, his eyes never leaving Danielle. She was still tied to the chair, frozen in the center of the storm, as the warehouse structure began to fail. A heavy industrial hook, suspended by a frayed cable from the ceiling, began to swing wildly, threatened by the buckling roof. Choi's second-in-command scrambled backward, gasping for air as he reached for a backup weapon. He was pinned against a support beam, completely exposed. Ji-won had the perfect opening. He could end it, finish the blood feud that had scarred his body and consumed his life for a decade. He could take the head of the man who had ordered his brother's death. But then, a sickening crack echoed from above. The support cable snapped. The massive iron hook and a ton of steel debris plummeted toward the center of the room, directly toward Danielle. Ji-won didn't hesitate. He turned his back on the enemy, abandoning his revenge at the very moment of victory. He lunged across the oil-slicked floor, his fingers clawing for the edge of Danielle's chair. He tackled her, the momentum carrying them both across the concrete just as the iron hook smashed into the floor where she had sat a heartbeat before. The impact sent a cloud of dust and pulverized stone into the air. He shielded her body with his own, his tattooed arms wrapped around her like a cage of iron. The rival gunman seized the chance to flee, disappearing into the smoke and the rain outside. Ji-won didn't chase him. He didn't even look. He fumbled with the ropes binding Danielle's wrists, his hands, usually so steady, trembling with a raw, terrifying desperation. When the last knot gave way, he pulled her to his chest, burying his face in her neck. "I have you," he rasped, his voice breaking through the cold facade. "I have you." In the wreckage of the kill zone, the Mafia boss had finally found something more important than his debt. He had chosen mercy, not for his enemy, but for the woman who had become his soul. 6 months later, the air in the Gangnam penthouse no longer tasted of metallic fear, but of jasmine and the crisp, clean scent of the Han River at dawn. The skyscraper remained a cathedral of glass and steel, but the magnetic locks now served to keep the world out, rather than to keep Danielle in. Danielle stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, no longer dressed in the expensive camouflage of a maid. She wore a tailored suit of ivory silk, her hair natural and full, her posture of a woman who had reclaimed every inch of her own soul. On the desk behind her, a tablet displayed the final liquidation of the Seven Stars' assets, a systematic dismantling of a criminal empire that had been replaced by a legitimate global logistics firm. The door opened and the familiar heavy vibration of Ji-won's presence filled the room. He looked different. The sharp, predatory edges of his silhouette had softened, though the intensity in his eyes remained. He walked toward her, discarding his blazer. The tattoos on his neck were still there, but they no longer looked like armor. They looked like history. "The transition is complete," he said, his voice a low hum that still made Danielle's heart skip. "The last of the offshore accounts have been funneled into the foundation. Your brother's name is cleared, Danielle. He's being honored as a hero in Detroit, and the debt collectors, they no longer exist. Danielle turned, a soft smile touching her lips. And what about the man who made it happen? Ji-hwan stopped inches from her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't kneel. He wasn't a man who bowed to anyone, but the way he looked at her was a total surrender. He opened the box to reveal a ring of black gold set with a single radiant diamond. "I told you once that you were an extension of my will," he whispered, taking her hand. His touch was warm, certain, and devoid of the old shadows. "I was wrong. You are the heartbeat that keeps that will alive. I don't need a shadow anymore, Danielle. I don't need a spy." He slid the ring onto her finger, the cold metal a stark contrast to the heat of his skin. "I need a partner. I need a wife. I want to sign one final contract with you, one where the only terms are loyalty, and the only duration is forever." Danielle looked at the ring, then up at the man who had locked a door to change her life and ended up opening his heart to save it. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, feeling the steady, honest thrum of his pulse. "Only if there's no exit clause," she murmured. Ji-hwan pulled her into a kiss that tasted of redemption and new beginnings. "Never," he promised. As the sun rose over a city they now navigated as equals, Danielle finally felt truly seen. They had survived the dark, and in the light, they were finally free.